Good morning, everybody. Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov. Welcome back. Becoming just a quick announcement as we begin. Next week, there will not be a shiur. In fact, I won't be giving any other shiurim next week because I won't be here. Be giving other shiurim in London. Everybody's most welcome to attend, but it might be a bit far. So, anyway, so next week there will not be a shiur. The following week, we will resume as normal, Be'ezrat Hashem, all being well. So, we are working our way through volume 20 after we skipped, but we're back to volume 20 of Tzurba M'Rabbanan, Hilchot Shabbat. We're on the second shiur in the book. We're going to begin this morning on page 86. We are dealing with the halachot of personal care on Shabbat. There are many things that are involved in personal care. We spoke about washing, we spoke about cutting nails, cutting one's hair, etc. All sorts of things which one would not do on Shabbat and why that is. I mentioned last week that a lot of these halachot may not be relevant for everybody, right? Especially the ones about hair and the ones about makeup, etc. Don't apply to everybody, but nonetheless, and we do derive many important principles in terms of hilchot Shabbat. So even if this may not, we spoke last week about gozez, about sharing. Again, I saw one of the updates, a message went out. Have you ever had the urge to share your sheep on Shabbat? Most people probably haven't. But nonetheless, we learned about the definitions of melacha she'eina tzrocha legufa and different principles and applications which apply to all of us. And that is also part of our purpose here, understanding the halachic process, understanding the halachic system. Even if not every single question, although many of them are, but maybe if not every single question we discuss is going to be halacha l'maaseh for each and every one of us. So we begin today on page 86, dealing with halacha of braiding hair. So again, this may not apply to everybody, but if you have daughters or you have granddaughters, so it may very well apply, right? Is one allowed to? What does one do with one's hair on Shabbat? So we saw. Well, let's see. The Mishnah in source number 28, we're on page 86. Source number 28, the Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat says, "Chena godelet, v'chena kochelet, v'chena apokeset." I think we mentioned this last week. Rabbi Eliezer mechayev, chachamim osrim mishum shvut. We saw there are a number of different melachot, a number of different activities, whereby we have a machloket between Rabbi Eliezer and chachamim. Okay, in the Mishnah, there's three activities: godelet, kochelet, and pokeset. All three of these, Rabbi Eliezer says one is chayev, i.e., he holds these are going to be a Torah prohibition, whereas the Chachamim Osrim Mishum Shvut, they say they are going to be forbidden by a rabbinic decree. Okay, what are we talking about? What are these actions? And more than that, what are these actions? But what is the malacha that is behind them? Right? There is no malacha of godelet or pokeset or kochelet, clearly. But so we see the Gemara, source number 29. Gemara asks a question. It says, what are you going to be chayav for? What is the melacha? It's interesting. In the Yerushalmi, there is a discussion. Yerushalmi has a discussion that says Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish would go through all the significant actions that people do, and they would say, why are these forbidden on Shabbat? They would take, they'd go through the whole list, all the things that a person does during the course of working. And they would say, okay, this is going to be the melacha of boneh, and this is the melacha of kotev, and this is the melacha of... They would go through all and establish which melacha it was. If they couldn't find any melacha, then they said, this is makeh b'patish. Makeh b'patish is the final hammer blow. That's one of the 39 melachot. And but what's very interesting, you see from there that sometimes they weren't sure exactly which category it fit in, but they knew that it was forbidden. They knew that, and therefore, if it didn't fit neatly into any one of the categories, it would be the makeh b'patish. And based on that, Yerushalmi, Rav Shavais, is a very unique approach when it comes to electricity. And he says operating an electrical device on Shabbat would be asur. Why? Some say boneh, some say molid, some say... He says makeh b'patish. It's clear to us that it's a significant action. We're not necessarily sure which category it falls into. Based on Yerushalmi, he says makeh b'patish. Others argue. But that's, anyway, this is a pattern which repeats itself. We see throughout hilchot Shabbat. We understand that melacha, creative labor, is going to be forbidden. And sometimes it's an act that's clear to us. It's an act of creative labor. It's not exactly clear to us which category it neatly falls into, but it's certainly, according to Rabbi Eliezer, this is a melacha d'oraita. So the Gemara discusses. So it says, so actually, there's a few different opinions here. First of all, Amar Rabbi Avin, Amar Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Godelet, mishum oreget, kochelet, mishum kotevet, pokeset, mishum toveh. Okay, so what are all these things? It's not 100% clear exactly what each one is, but it's what we understand is this: godelet and pokeset are related to doing something with the hair, some form of braiding the hair, some form of separating the hair, maybe that's true with the hair. And kochelet sounds like the word. Kochelet sounds like right, blue. So there was this blue sort of makeup that they would apply. Maybe you still have it today. Here in the translation, it says blue eyeshadow. Okay, some sort of blue makeup that would apply to one's face, to one's eyes. And that also all of these things we say are going to be forbidden on Shabbat. Clearly, they're forbidden according to everybody. Question whether it's Doraita or Drabanan, and we'll see why that is. So the first suggestion here in the Gemara is as follows: Rabbi Avin says the name of Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina. It says godelet mishum oreget. It says godelet, again, this is sort of braiding the hair. He says that is similar to the melacha of weaving. Kochelet, okay, applying this blue color, he says is mishum kotevet, that's to do with writing. Pokeset mishum toveh, and or tova. And this final category, okay, already pokeset, not I said before to do with the hair, but not necessarily. Here it's translated as applying right, what does it say here in the translation? Applying blush. So you'll see, look at footnote number 21. Footnote number 21 says this word pokesa, there are two explanations brought in Rashi, right? Either it means, as I said before, fixing one's hair, or it can mean, the second explanation is applying some sort of powder on the face. The Rambam writes that it's a form of braiding as well. Okay, so here the first idea is that maybe it's related to spinning. So then the Gemara rejects that. It says, no, this is not the normal way of doing these things. And ultimately it comes to a different conclusion. Look at the top of page 87, because this is what is going to come down for the halacha. El amar Rabbi Abau, ledidi mefar shelei mini, the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, kochelet mishum tzovaat. Okay, that seems to make more sense to us, meaning applying this color, there is a melacha of coloring. Okay, there's a melacha of, maybe you might call it dyeing in our, right? Where they would take the hides for the Mishkan and they would need to dye them and to be a certain color for the materials. Okay, where is that going to apply? We'll talk about it. Does that mean any time I take something and it changes color, it's going to be a melacha of tzoveh? So we'll have to see. But applying color, which you want to be permanent, which you want it to be there for the sake of the color, a person puts this blue makeup on one's face or above one's eyes because they want it to appear blue. So that is going to be the melacha of tzova'at. So from there, we're going to get into the whole discussion about makeup, which, right, Eliana, is very relevant for you. Godelet upokeset mishum boneh. And these other types of braiding or doing whatever with the hair, or even applying this powder to one's face, that is going to be the prohibition of boneh, of building. You know, it's funny. Sometimes, again, we go through the list of melachot. I've mentioned this a number of times. Certain melachot that we know are very relevant to all of us. Cooking, right? Everybody who has to heat up food on Shabbat, you go into the kitchen, you want to put the food on the hot plate or whatever. Okay, you have an interaction with the melacha of cooking on Shabbat. We have to know how. Borer, sorting, very, very common. All sorts of instances that come up. We have to know how to avoid that melacha. You think there's certain melachot, you know, the melacha of plowing, the melacha of harvesting, the melacha of building. You know, everybody thinks, when am I going, I'm not a construction worker, certainly not on Shabbat, right? When am I going to come into contact with the melacha of building? Again, it's more common than you think. So braiding one's hair, that's going to be the melacha of building as well. So following on from that, Tosfot, in source number 30, you'll see writes, Usvalau, דחייכי יש איסור בעשיית כלייה, הכי נמי יש איסור בסתירת כלייה. Okay? If forming a braid in one's hair is going to be building, then undoing the braid from one's hair is going to be the melacha of soter, the melacha of destroying. So not only would it be forbidden to make a braid, it would be forbidden to undo a braid as well. That is what Tosfot says, and the Shulchan Aruch follows, source number 31. He says, Asur likloa ha'isha Se'ala b'Shabbat, v'lo la'atir kliyata. A woman may not braid her hair on Shabbat, untie on Shabbat. Notice as well that the Mishnah phrased everything in the feminine form, godelet, kochelet, pokeset. And the reason for that is it's going to be more common certainly going to be more common for women to braid their hair than for men to braid their hair. First of all, usually women have hair in the first place, but we'll see, is that going to affect halacha as well? Okay, just mention here because he talks about the melachot of binyan, boneh, and soter. Soter is an interesting malacha as well. The malacha of boneh is building, is construction, and soter is destroying. Right? We've discussed many times that in order for there to be a biblical malacha, in order for it to fit into the category of what we call melechet machshevet, it has to be, there are a number of conditions. One of the conditions that it has to be a constructive act. How can I have a malacha that is by nature a destructive act, destroying? How can that be a malacha on a d'oraita level? To Rabbanan, I can understand. Rabbi said sometimes you destroy something, it's still going to be an isur. But how can soter be a malacha? So the answer is that soter is only half the malacha. Right? It's brought in the Mishnah that the list of melachot, there's a malacha of boneh, which is building. There's a malacha of soter, al manat livnot. It's when you destroy for the purposes of building. Okay, now many drashot and wonderful things that we can say based on this idea. But when you have a building, when there is, imagine hypothetically that you lived in a city in which there was a lot of construction taking place. Imagine, right? Hypothetically. But so what happens? You have a building, right? You have a Tama 38, right? You have to destroy the building, not for the purposes of destroying it, although sometimes it feels that way, but you're destroying it for the purpose of building something better. But in order to build, you have to remove what's already there, and you have to go down to the foundations, you have to strengthen it, or whatever. So that's the malacha of soter. On a biblical level, that's how it works. On a Rabbanan level, still, it may be that just soter by itself, as we say, could still be forbidden. We have the same thing with a number of melachot. For example, there's a malacha of korea, of ripping, right? How? Because the Gemara explains how ripping could actually be a constructive act, right? We've spoken in the past about ripping open packages of food, etc. That is generally speaking going to be permitted. One should be careful not to tear the letters, etc. There's a malacha of writing and there's a malacha of erasing. Again, over there the idea is it's erasing in order to write. So that's at least on a d'oraita, on a biblical level. On a d'Rabbanan level, there can be a concept of a destructive act, which is forbidden as well. So Tosfot tells us, Shulchan Aruch paskins, that braiding one's hair and untying the braid, both of those are going to be forbidden. The Mishnah Berurah, Yossi source number 32, excuse me, he writes that all of this is a rabbinic prohibition. Again, we still have to keep rabbinic prohibition. But he says, midrabanan. In other words, this is not actually the act of building itself, but it is similar to the act of building, and therefore it is asur drabanan, right? You are constructing the braid, so to speak. Now he says over the page that all that is when it's regarding one's own hair that is attached to one's head. Right? What about if you're braiding the hair of a wig, of what's called the sheitel nowadays? After en b'zeh mishum boneh, that would not be considered building, but nonetheless asur kol panim mishum oleg. That in fact would be weaving, and that would be forbidden at least Rabbanan. And then he says, very interestingly, so this will be prohibited rabbinically. It says there are certain things, you can't get in the way. If people are not going to listen to us, then it's mutar, as we've discussed. Was it in this shiur or different? I think it was in the Gemara shiur. We discussed the principle of mutav sheyu shogagin v'al mazidin. There's a concept in halacha where sometimes if you're going to give people rebuke, they are not going to listen to you. It's when they don't know that something is forbidden. So then it would not be better not to tell them because they're not going to listen, and better they should do it carelessly rather than negligently. That does not apply when something is an explicit prohibition in the Torah. Even if they don't know about it, we say we should still tell them. Okay, now, important leniency. The hilchot Shabbat, there's a contemporary work in hilchot Shabbat. He quotes here Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says, "She'isur kliya ne'emar dafka כשחולכת שערה לשלושה חלקים או יותר." I'm not an expert in terms of how to braid one's hair, even though I have a daughter. But he says if you have 3 parts at least that are braided together, or 3 sections that are braided together, that is similar to building. That's going to be forbidden. אבל צמא העשויה משני חלקים But if it's just two sections that are being braided together, okay, he says that would not be prohibited. The Minchat Yitzchak, Rav Weiss, in source number 34, he says that right, what we've mentioned that all of this is in the feminine. It's far more common for women to be braiding their hair, but if it is the common practice for men to braid their hair, I don't know if they have what are they called, dreadlocks, right? Or that sort of thing. So he says that ultimately there is no difference for men and women in this case, and that prohibition would apply there as well. Just the part which is in bold. So normally it's more common that the braids are taking place in women's hair. If that's the way that men have hair and they commonly perform these activities, pshita. It would be forbidden for men to braid their hair as well, and therefore he concludes that for a father to braid his daughter's hair, that's also going to be prohibited on Shabbat. Now, Yalkut Yosef, source number 35, says Asur l'isha lekloa tzara b'Shabbat. One may not twist one's hair to make braids on Shabbat, v'lo la'atir kliata, and not to undo it, as we've already seen. וכן אסור לקלוע בשבת את השערות בהנחת סיכות מיוחדות הגורמות שהשערות יהיו מגולגלות כמו בקבוקים קטנים. By putting curlers and enrolling the hair. You can see here there is a picture. For those of us who do not know, for those of us who do not know how this works, but he says that would be forbidden as well. This is similar to braiding. If it's just to take all the, bunch up the hairs and tie a bow around them or something like that, so he says that would be permitted. That's not considered building as such. Okay. Let me just share with you something which is not in your books, but it's a question that I saw very interesting. Right? As you know, I'm on this group of Rav Rimon. Over 1,000 rabbis from around the world are on this group, and they send him questions every day, and he answers the questions. Sometimes I even read them. So he was asked a question a few days ago relating to this. The rabbi in question asked, I think he's a teacher in a high school, and he was asked a number of questions by the girls in the high school regarding dealing with the hair on Shabbat, and he has no idea what they're doing or what to do. So the three questions were, one is regarding spray. He says it's a spray which seems to keep the hair straight. Are you allowed to spray? Are you allowed to use hairspray? The second one relates to what we just said now. Are they allowed to use eyelash curler, where they curl the eyelashes on Shabbat? And the third one was helix curls, which apparently is used to take straight hair and make it curly. Again, as I say, I'm not an expert on any of these things, but that's like the Bakvuk Katan, exactly. So I'll read you the answer that Rav Rimon gives. And the first thing he says, this is so characteristic. He says, "Shakoch gadol tamidot shechashuva lehin shmirat Shabbat." He says, right, the shakoch to the girls, it's very important. You could just say, it's the hair, it's whatever. No, it's important. It's shmirat Shabbat. We always get excited about the questions that the chayalim ask. I was like, look at our chayalim. Look at the questions they ask about, halacha. So look at our high school students. Look at the questions they ask as well. So he says regarding hairspray, he says there are two types of hairspray. There's a type which hardens the hair, right? And he says that would fall into this category of pokeset. What we said, pokeset, which is something to do, according to at least one of the opinions, is related to with the hair. And the Rivash is one of the Rishonim. He explains Rashi as follows. He explains that pokeset means atikun she'osin ha'ne'arot she'achar she'roshan saruk yafeh. Once the hair has been combed and there's no concern that we're going to remove hairs, it says they would take the comb and they would wash it in oil and water, and then they would use last week we learned that you can't comb one's hair if it's going to dislodge, right, because the hair is to detach. So here the hair has been combed in such a way that concern does not exist, but this comb was dipped in this oil and water, which nowadays we just use spray, right? And then that goes through the hair. In order to, I guess, cause the hairs to attach one to another and to stay and to make it firmer. Essentially, it says that is similar to building, and therefore that that type of hairspray, he says, one cannot use on Shabbat. That would transgress this prohibition. On the other hand, the second type of spray, which apparently softens the hair or just gives it, just makes it feel fresh. That, he says, would be allowed. Regarding curling eyelashes, so there he says there is place to allow this, because he calls it's a tikkun katan yachasit. It's not this is not similar to building, whatever. It's making a small change to the hairs, to the eyelashes, and that would be allowed, so long as one is not removing the hairs, removing the eyelashes. And he says you should try it on a weekday before, just to see how it works. Not in terms of how it looks, but in terms of whether it's going to dislodge the eyelashes, etc. Regarding the bakbukim ktanim, right, that we saw here, the curlers, to making one's hair curly, that he says that would be a problem. That would be a problem, because that is also related to godelet and bonans, making a big change in the appearance of one's hair, and that would be related to the prohibitions that we saw before. I think he actually quotes the very same Yalkut Yosef that we have in Tzurba Merabanan. Don't think Rav Rimon was learning Tzurba, but anyway, he could have written it by memory. But that's what he says there. Okay, so onto page 90. So that's in terms of tying the hair together, right? What about parting the hair? So we've seen the problem about combing, and we've seen the problem about braiding, just parting, sort of separating one's hair, right? So the Gemara here in source number 36 says, B'Shabbat lamai chazia. Okay, here the Gemara is talking about carrying, but there was an eyeless needle that they would have. What would they carry an eyeless needle for? So Amar Rava, Tasha zahav yesh la losha b'chol, choleket b'asteala, b'Shabbat manichata keneged padachta. And they would use it to part the hair. Now, what's interesting, the Gemara says this sort of this needle, right? Again, it's a needle without a hole, so it's not used for sewing, but it's used for this. It says on a weekday they would use a choleket base'ar to separate the hair, and on Shabbat they would use it sort of like a jewel, like an ornament. Okay, so the Gemara seems to imply that you cannot part the hair on Shabbat. So Rashi says here, halei b'Shabbat eina choleket se'ala. It says on Shabbat you cannot part the hair. That seems to imply that it is prohibited. Tosfot learns differently. Tosfot says, he says the reason why, he says, b'Shabbat lamay chazani shel gilad b'shvil shetzcha lachalek b'se'ara b'Shabbat teve masui kevan den lo mabush v'lo tachshit. It says, what are you using it for on Shabbat? That's the question. So top of page 91, it says b'kuntras pirish b'samuch b'Shabbat lamay chazia v'lo b'Shabbat eina choleket se'ara. That's what Rashi said. V'kasher li. Here's one of the Balatos. Chada manale de asul lachalek b'se'ar b'Shabbat. Who says? What are you talking about? Who says you can't part one's hair on Shabbat? Ve'od damai palech v'asul afilu imutar tikshev ha'masuyu. Okay, and so the Shulchan Aruch, you see in source number 39, says asul l'klo isha se'ar b'Shabbat, as we already said, cannot braid the hair on Shabbat. V'lo latil kliyata, not to untie the braid, but avay yichola lachlok se'ara, to just part the hair. That would be permitted. Okay, I was like Tosfot, the Ramah says Yeshul Slim. There are those that are stringent on it as well. Okay, so that is essentially concludes our discussion of hair on Shabbat. So to summarize, we said last week that brushing or combing one's hair is going to be a problem where one knows that hairs are going to be detached, or even if it's possible and it's likely that hairs will be detached. One cannot comb in such a way. If one has a soft brush that's not going to cause hairs to be detached, then that's fine. Then one can brush hair in that way. On Shabbat, today we spoke about braiding one's hair. Godela, we said that is similar to the Melacha of Binyan. It's probably going to be an Isur de Rabbanan. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, if one braids only 2 sections and not 3, especially if it's not done in a very tight way, I think that's the idea, then that would be permitted. We said the prohibition would apply to men and to women equally. To use curlers to try and curl one's hair on Shabbat, that would be forbidden as well. We also spoke about hairspray, and we said regarding parting hair, so there are different opinions, but generally if one uses just with one's hand, then one could be lenient in terms of that. Okay, We have discussion about makeup, which I'm going to skip for the moment. Maybe we'll come back to it. But there's a bit of a discussion about makeup. If you go to page 97, with makeup, the issues may be, again, related to binyan, may be related to tzovea. That's probably the major issue in terms of coloring. And there is a bit of a discussion amongst the poskim regarding certain makeup that is going to be permanent, right? Or what is permanent, at least is going to stay for over 24 hours, etc. That would be more problematic. There are many poskim, there are some poskim that are going to be machmir, stringent on any makeup, but others will say that so long as it is not permanent, that is going to be permitted. And there are all sorts of Shabbos makeups, etc. That is, you can see in source number 48. There's a long discussion here in terms of how makeup applies. Okay, but as I say, I'm going to skip that for the moment. Let's go to page 97. We talk about applying oils and creams. This comes up very, very often. It's a very, very common question on Shabbat. You have cream. Sometimes if a person has a cut or has different the different rashes or whatever it is, can be for children, can be for babies, can be for adults as well, that you need to apply a cream on Shabbat. Is that permitted to rub the cream in one's skin? Sometimes you have it with insect repellent or things like that. Suntan lotion, right? Sunscreen, that is a very, very common question. It was less common in England because there's no sun there. But in this country, it tends to come up quite a lot. So let's have a look. Page 97. The Gemara talks about oil, talks about rubbing oil in one's body. Now, there are two separate issues, I'll just say, when we're discussing applying creams, oils, lotions, etc. One is in terms of if one is doing it for a medicinal purpose. So there is a separate category, and there's a separate discussion of whether one is allowed to perform things which are for the sake of refuah on Shabbat. Somebody asked me the question this Shabbat, we were sitting at Tzurba Shlishit, and somebody said, somebody who is taking antibiotics, this is what the person said to me, that somebody told them that they were told that if they're taking antibiotics during the week on Shabbat, they can't carry on taking them. They have to wait till after Shabbat because there's a gzeirah against taking medicine on Shabbat. So I told them that is partially true, but I would humbly suggest that the psak is not correct for the following reason. What is the issue with taking? So Chazal made a gzeirah against medicine, against refuah on Shabbat. Why? Because in the days of Chazal, how did one make medicine? Right? You would crush herbs. And that would be that's how you would produce the medicine. It's called shchikat samamanim. Shchikat samamanim means crushing, grinding herbs in order to produce the medicines. That is a melacha. That is the av melacha of tochen. Tochen is one of the melachot of grinding, and therefore Chazal said, one cannot take medicine, or one cannot do any medicinal activity is included in this category. Okay. First thing which has changed since the days of Chazal is we no longer grind our own medicines. Hopefully, right? Most of you, if you are sick, right, and you need to take a medicine, a tablet or a lozenge or a syrup or whatever it is, you'll go to the pharmacy and you'll purchase, right, something that is registered. Is that right? That's the way it is nowadays. So on the one hand, this idea of this concern that we're going to go and start grinding and crushing our medicines, first of all, it's made in a completely different way. But second of all, nobody does it. So we know that we have a principle, which is that even though the reason for the Gzerah no longer applies, we are not in a position, we don't have a Sanhedrin, we're not in a position today where we can undo the Gzerah of Chazal. So therefore we would still keep it. There are cases, where there is a question, where there is a case of doubt, where there are other mitigating factors. So that is something which we would take into consideration. But that would not be on itself, in and of itself, enough to cancel the Gzerah. However, what is it that most people misunderstand? And again, later on, we'll have more shiurim discussing fully the topic of refuah and Shabbat, but I'm just mentioning it because it's important and it's relevant for now. There are three categories of sick people on Shabbat, really four, but for now, for our purposes, we'll say three. We know that there is a chole, and you have these categories applying Shabbat, these categories applying other places in halacha as well. For example, when it comes to fast days, other things. The definitions, by the way, are not necessarily going to be the same in one area of halacha as they are in another. But the three broad categories, broadly speaking, of sick people on Shabbat is a chole sheyesh bo sakana. Right, none of this, what I'm saying, is in the book right now. But there's a chole sheyesh bo sakana, which means somebody who is has a life-threatening illness, what we call pikuach nefesh. There's no question. A person needs to take medicine. A person needs to do malacha. You need to cook for the person. You do shech for the person because you don't have any meat. That's permitted. That's chole sheyesh bo sakana. That is pikuach nefesh. But then we have what's called a chole she'ein bo sakana, which means an unwell person. It's not life-threatening, but they are sick. Meaning, generally speaking, we'd say a person is bedridden, right? A person cannot get out of bed, or there are other ways to define it as well. But that is it. And thirdly, we have what's called a mechush ba'alma. Mechush ba'alma means a person who is generally healthy, right? They're not sick. They might have a bit of a headache. They might have a bit of a whatever. Generally speaking, I think somebody has a fever. We'd probably say that they fall into the category of chole she'ein bo sakana. Hopefully, unless they're chole sheyesh bo sakana, right? But so that is. So what a lot of people don't realize, and a lot of people misunderstand, that when Chazal made a gzeira against taking medicine on Shabbat, Chazal didn't say that a sick person can't take the medicine they need to get better. No, a chole she'ein bo sakana is allowed to take medicine. It's somebody who is a healthy person, who is a mechush ba'alma. That is where Chazal made the decree. That is where they said that person can't take medicine. So, case in point, right? A person on Shabbat has a headache, or has a sore throat, or has something. So it depends how severe it is. If it's not very severe at all, it's a very, very light thing. You can get over it. And maybe part of the way to measure, it's not the only benchmark, but part of the way to measure would be, what would you do on a weekday? Right? If on a weekday you would go on and you would carry on working and you would carry on and you would just get on with things, so then we would say that you're not considered sick. If on a weekday, right, you'd go home and you'd rest in bed, so a person has a very, very mild headache, then they should not take medicine, because that is the gzera of shchikat samanim. If a person has a more severe, or feels like they can't get out of bed, or feels like it's very, very difficult, they feel very unwell, so then that would be a chole she'ein bo sakana, and therefore they could take the medicine they need to take. So somebody who's taking antibiotics for the reason that they've been sick would probably be a chole she'ein bo sakana. The truth is that even if we say the person started taking the antibiotics and now it's 3 days later, the course is for 7 days, 3 days later they have no more symptoms, so you might say they're no longer in the category of chole she'ein bo sakana, but nonetheless there are tshuvot, and there is ample sources and reasoning for the fact that once a person has started taking the medicine, they can continue on Shabbat. Okay, but we digress. The point is that this gzeira for a healthy person against taking medicine does not just apply to the types of medicines that might have involved grinding, etc., but it applies to any type of medicinal activity. So that would fall under the category of refuah on Shabbat. So as I say, we will explore that more fully in a later shiur. That is one discussion that needs to be understood when it comes to applying medicinal creams, etc. There is a separate discussion, which is more direct, which is the cream itself. By rubbing in the cream, am I transgressing potentially a melacha of memachek or memarech, etc. So we're on page 97. So the Mishnah here, first of all, talks about oil. In the days of the Mishnah, I think you didn't have as many creams as you do nowadays, but you had oil, right? And even today, you still get baby oil or whatever it is for certain things. So the Mishnah here says that one is experiencing pain, one is allowed to rub oil. Okay, there's another element to this, which is that the Mishnah is addressing the fact that when would people use oil? When would they rub oil on the joints or whatever? If it's done for medicinal reasons, so then that's the first problem we spoke about. That's the gzera of shchikat samanim. But if it's something that healthy people do as well, even though I'm doing it for medicinal reasons, that would be permitted. Because it could be something, so for example, a person has a sore throat on Shabbat and they want to drink tea. We discussed once upon a time how to make tea on Shabbat. I refer you to that discussion. But a person wants to drink tea. Healthy people also drink tea. Therefore, tea is considered not just, it's a machal briyim also, and therefore somebody who's doing it for medicinal purposes, because it's also done for regular purposes, one can take it. Again, nobody takes a tablet for regular purposes. If you do, then well, that's a separate discussion. Okay, so the Mishnah says, "Achoshesh b'motnav," one is experiencing pain. Lo yisuch yain v'chometz. So you should not smear wine and vinegar on them, because that was only what sick people would do. Thankfully, modern medicine has advanced a little bit. But but he can rub oil, right? And that's what the Shulchan Aruch says. Source number 52. החושש מוניו, לא יעשו שמן וחומץ, ועשו שמן לבדו. אבל לא בשמן ולד, משום דמוכח מילתא דרפואה כבד. That's the phrase, right? מוכח מילתא means that it's אם הוא מקום שמצוי בו שמן ולד, ודרך בני אדם לסוחו, אפילו ברפואה מותר. If you live in a place where everybody uses rose oil, then that's fine. ובמקום שאין נוהגים לסוך שמן, כי אם לרפואה בכל שמן אסור. Says the Rama, the converse. If we now have a situation where people don't use oil anymore, unless for a medical purpose, then you could not, then you could not do it, even though the Mishnah said, and that's the way it would be nowadays as well. Shema Shabbat Kilchatan, source 53, he says, Me'agaon, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Shamati, תכל שהשיחה מונעת גילויים מסתבר הרי זה חשיב כרפואה. Right? If you're going to spread oil to prevent itching or whatever, nowadays people use that as a medical purpose, and therefore that is going to be forbidden. Okay, regarding the creams and ointments, etc. So we have the melacha of memachek. Memachek is the melacha of smoothing animal hides. That's what they would do. These hides they would use for the Mishkan. Okay, so the Mishnah, well, the Gemara here on Masechet Shabbat, source number 54. Samar Rabbi Acha bar Chanina, hashaf ben amudim b'Shabbat. Right, if one is rubbing these hides between pillars on Shabbat, that is the melacha of memachek. Now we have a tolada of that, which is hamimareach l'tiyah b'Shabbat. L'tiyah is a type of bandage. It's a type of bandage they had in the days of the Mishnah. It had some sort of cream, some sort of ointment underneath it. So it says hamimalech, somebody who spreads out this cream under the bandage, chayav mishum memachek. So mimareach, that is the tolada of this melacha of memachek, of smoothing out. So smoothing out this cream, spreading out this cream, that seemingly, based on the Gemara, is going to be forbidden. Based on that, we would say that anytime you want to spread a cream on one's skin, that would be forbidden. So the Magen Avraham here gives us an important leniency. Magen Avraham here in source 55 says, "Memaleach lo shayach אלא כשכוונתו שיתמלח דבר על גבי חברו." Meaning I have one object which I'm spreading on top of another surface. אבל הכה רוצה שיבלע בקרקע. But when I have something which is completely absorbed, then that is not going to be forbidden. So based on this Magen Avraham, we say the following. If I have a cream, if the purpose of the cream is to be absorbed into one's skin, to be completely absorbed into one's body, I don't want to leave anything, I don't want to leave a layer on top, then if I'm spreading it in such a way that it's completely absorbed, that would be permitted. And that is what we see, yes, the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata, source number 56. Again, Shmat Shabbat was written by Rav Neuwirth, who survived the Holocaust, has an amazing story of how he survived and how he came to learn specifically hilchot Shabbat, and as a result, and why he did that, it's in the introduction. If you have there are 3 editions of Shmat Shabbat Kilchata. The first edition just had all the prohibitions, right? Then they added in all the footnotes of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. That's the second edition, the most common one. The third edition, which was done a few years ago by Feldheim, there are 2 volumes, but the third edition was only the first volume was published in the third edition. Before Rav Neuwirth passed away. So they never got to, there is no second volume in the final edition. But he was a Talmud. He was one of the closest Talmudim of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And that is why, and he gave the Sefer to Rav Shlomo Zalman, who went through the entire Sefer and added his footnotes. And many of the things which are forbidden by the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata, Rav Shlomo Zalman had the Koach Hetera, and he's able to write why things would be permitted. Many years ago, I think it was, I won't say which, but one of the publishing houses, they translated the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata into English. They only translated the top section without any of the footnotes and any of the things of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So the joke is, we said before, that the Shmat Shabbat Kilchata, certainly the English edition, is a cliche melachto le'isur, because everything's asur. But in the footnotes sometimes there are. In any event, so source 56, it says, here in bold, Megon Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach Zatzal Shamati, I heard from Rav Shlomo Zalman the following, if you have cream that entirely dissolves and is absorbed within a person's body, so that that is not considered smoothing, and that would be permitted. Okay, so you can see in the box underneath that Rav Ovadia also permits spreading such creams, even for a person who's not sick. Rav Daniel Neustadt, who's a posek in America, he writes that many poskim do not agree with this more lenient approach, but they allow relying on it in cases of need. The other thing that you can do is in a situation, sometimes the ointment or the oil or the cream is very, very thick. It's not going to be absorbed. But if it's just dabbing it on, if one dabs it onto the skin without rubbing, again, the issue of smoothing is if one starts rubbing the cream. But if one does not rub it at all, one just places it, that would be permitted. So let's see, 57, right? Several poskim are of the opinion that spreading ointment on the skin is a violation of smoothing, memarech. Other poskim are not concerned about this issue, but most follow the more stringent view and advise to avoid spreading ointment on Shabbat. The recommended method, therefore, is to squeeze ointment from the tube directly onto the affected area. A bandage may then be placed over the ointment, even though this may result in spreading the ointment because that's done indirectly, without kavanah, etc. If for some reason the above option cannot be used, some poskim permit to spread ointment on the skin, provided that all the ointment is absorbed and nothing remains on the surface. According to this opinion, smoothing applies only when some substance remains on the surface and is then smoothed down and leveled. Does not apply when all of the ointment is absorbed and nothing remains externally. Right? As we said, that's based on the Magen Avraham. He says not everybody agrees, but that does apply. Now, Rav Melamed adds that if the cream is for the purpose of enjoyment or beauty, so these are creams that you don't want to be fully absorbed, so then that leniency would not apply. Over the page, source number 58, says a krem shenoad la'anah yofi. You don't want it to be entirely absorbed. You want it to be there to smoothen out the skin or whatever it is. That you cannot spread on Shabbat. Right, and so all of this applies to creams that have some sort of thickness. If there is a liquid, if it's completely liquid, so then that would be forbidden. There's no permitted. There is no so deodorant, for example. I can use a spray deodorant or a spray insect repellent, or same thing with the sun cream, etc. So let's just see the summary here in the hilchot Shabbat. Again, contemporary work, source number 60. Says the hilchot Shabbat, En nimuach mishcha mishum misum machek. We should not. Our default, our starting position is we would not spread creams. One who is using a cream, again, under the conditions that one is allowed to, that we're not transgressing the prohibition against using medicine. So, for example, somebody has, a chronic condition. Sometimes you have a skin condition or whatever. Somebody puts it needs to apply cream to their skin every single day for, psoriasis or something like that. So again, that would not transgress. Then there would be no issue in terms of refuah on Shabbat because they would fall into that category where it's a permanent medication that one uses. But you would still have the question of rubbing the cream. So lo yimachenu klal. So don't rub it, but just place it, dab it directly. Okay, you could squeeze it from the tube directly onto the wound without spreading. Top of page 101. Hand cream to make your hands become a bit smoother, right? Coming up to the winter, this is always a problem, to get rid of the dryness, etc. So to rub one's hands with cream, there he says would be a problem. Right? But if it's oil or something which is liquid, you could use that. Again, with the caveat relating to medical purposes. Cream that you put on for beautification, that is prohibited, as we've said. Spreading lipstick and the like, he says that would be an issue of tzoveh. אין למרוח על השפתיים מיני משחות על מנת למנוע יובש, ואף אם המשחה מצב מוקשה, אין להשתמש בו. So spreading creams designed to, whether it's like lip balm and the like, that also one should not spread on Shabbat. And he says, אין להשתמש בתכשיר למניעת זיעה, עשוי מחום מוקשה הנמרח על הגוף. So the stick deodorants. That is solid, that one would be smoothing out, that one cannot use. On Shabbat, sometimes you have insect repellents the same way, the sort of roll-on. See a picture here of stick deodorant and roll-on. If you're not sure what we're talking about, that one cannot use. But if it's chomin nuzli, if it is liquid, then that would be permitted. Okay. I think we'll stop there for today. The next section, we have one more discussion relating to personal care before we get to animals. We have a couple of discussions, interesting halachot related to animals on Shabbat, and then we're going to move on to muktzah. Eventually, we'll get there. The next section is relating to brushing one's teeth. I'll just say, using an electric toothbrush. One cannot use an electric toothbrush on Shabbat, but using a normal toothbrush. So there are questions that are raised relating to toothbrushes, relating to toothpaste, relating to memarech, as we've seen, relating to schita, etc. But I'm going to leave that. I'm going to whet your appetite. So we will talk about that next time. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day. Again, next week, there is no shiur, but the following week, Bezrat Hashem, we will resume.